Have you ever wondered what lies hidden behind a person's eyes? Not just their thoughts or their feelings, but the entire universe of a life they lived before they crossed your path. We pass people every day, the person sweeping the floor, the one serving coffee, the quiet figure in the corner, and we assign them a role, a label. We see the uniform, not the soul. We see the job, not the journey. But what if we are wrong? What if the person you overlook every single day holds a secret so profound it could change everything you thought you knew about greatness? This is a story about a ghost, a legend, and a woman who was simply waiting for someone to see her. Not for who she appeared to be, but for who she truly was. The hangar was a cathedral of steel and shadows, a place where metal gods slept under vast, vaulted ceilings. By day, it roared with the symphony of engines and the sharp commands of men who touched the sky. By night, it fell into a reverent hush, the only sound the gentle hum of latent power and the soft, rhythmic swish of a mop against polished concrete. This was Ilara's world. A world of echoes and silhouettes. She was one of the night shift custodians at the Hyperleet Uz Air Force Base, a ghost in a grey jumpsuit, her presence as unnoticed as the dust motes dancing in the security lights. Her face, often partially obscured by the hood of her sweatshirt, was plain but etched with a quiet sorrow that made her seem older than her 28 years. She moved with an efficiency that was almost invisible, her cart of supplies gliding silently beside her. She cleaned the offices of colonels, the break rooms of pilots, and the gleaming floors of the briefing theater where heroes were made. She saw their faces on plaques, their confident smiles in framed photographs, but she never met their eyes. To them, she was just part of the building, a function, not a person. Tonight, her route took her to the simulator wing. This was the heart of the base, a technological marvel where pilots battled digital enemies in multi-million-dollar machines that could replicate the heavens and the hell of aerial combat. The room was empty now, the simulators dormant, their cockpit screens dark and lifeless. But for Ilara, they were anything but. They were sarcophagi of dreams, both hers and those of the father she had lost. She stopped her cart, her hand resting on the cool metal frame of Simulator 7. Her fingers traced the stenciled number, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. She could almost hear his voice, a warm baritone filled with laughter and love, explaining the intricate dance of flight. "It's not about power, Ellie," he used to say, his hands guiding hers on a much simpler joystick in a video game long ago. "It's about instinct. You don't fly the plane. You become the plane." She pulled her hood lower, a reflexive gesture to hide the tears that threatened to well in her eyes. It had been 10 years since she had lost him, 10 years since the sky had stolen everything from her and she had vowed never to look up again. Yet here she was, drawn to this place night after night, a moth to a flame that had already burned her. The longing was a physical thing, a hollow space inside her that ached for the pull of G-forces and the boundless blue. With a trembling hand, she pushed her cart aside and walked towards the simulator, the polished floor reflecting her solitary figure like a ghost on black water. The air inside the empty training facility was still and cold, carrying the faint, sterile scent of ozone and metal. Ilara stood before the hulking machine, a dormant beast of wires and alloy. Its canopy was ajar, an invitation into a world she had locked away. For a moment, she was frozen by a war raging within her. One voice, scarred and cautious, screamed at her to turn back, to stick to the shadows where it was safe, where the past couldn't reach her. But another voice, a whisper from a younger, more hopeful version of herself, urged her forward. It was the voice that remembered the smell of jet fuel on her father's flight suit, the thrill in his eyes when he spoke of breaking the sound barrier. Hesitantly, she reached out and her fingers brushed against the simulator's cold fuselage. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up her arm. It felt like coming home. Giving in to the impulse that was more powerful than a decade of grief, she climbed the small metal steps and slid into the pilot's seat. The worn leather creaked softly, molding around her as if it remembered her. Her hands, calloused from mops and cleaning agents, moved with an eerie, muscle-deep memory. They hovered over the control stick, the throttle, the array of glowing buttons and switches, not with the hesitation of a stranger, but with the innate familiarity of a prodigy. Her eye scanned the console, and she powered up the system. The screens flickered to life, bathing the cockpit in a soft, blue light. On the main display, a list of training scenarios appeared. Her gaze drifted past the standard drills, takeoffs, landings, dogfighting basics, and settled on one at the very bottom of the list, a program legendary among the pilots for its impossibility. It was called the Hades Gauntlet. It was not a training module, it was a myth. A brutal, unwinnable simulation designed by a sadist to test the absolute limits of both pilot and machine against overwhelming odds. No one had ever survived it. The base record was a mere 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Her father had once told her about it, calling it the ultimate test of instinct over training. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Instinct. She selected the program. The canopy hissed shut, sealing her in darkness before the panoramic screens ignited, creating a perfect, terrifying illusion of a midnight sky over a jagged, hostile mountain range. An automated voice, cold and devoid of emotion, echoed in the small space. Hades Gauntlet initiated. Survival probability, 0-inch. Alara took a deep breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the stick. The simulation began. And the janitor, the ghost of the night shift, vanished. In her place, a pilot was reborn. She didn't just fly, she danced. The jet on the screen became an extension of her own body, weaving through canyons with impossible grace, anticipating enemy fire before it was even launched, and turning certain death into a dazzling display of aerial artistry. She was a storm, a whisper, a phantom. She was her father's daughter. And she was magnificent. General Marcus Thorne stared at the tactical display in his office, his face illuminated by the cold, digital glow. He was a man carved from granite and sleepless nights, his shoulders burdened by the weight of command. For weeks, he'd been grappling with a growing sense of unease. His pilots, the so-called best of the best, were becoming complacent. They were textbook aces, technically perfect but rigid, predictable. They relied on protocol and procedure, their flying as sterile as a computer program. They lacked the fire, the creative spark, the intuitive genius that separates a good pilot from a legend. He ran a hand over his tired face, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. He needed a spark. A catalyst. Something to shake them from their comfortable mediocrity. It was past 2 a.m., and the base was quiet, but Thorne often worked late, sifting through data, looking for an edge. His screen showed the live feed from the simulator wings logs. Mostly, it was empty at this hour. But then, something caught his eye. An anomaly. Simulator 7 was active. That was unusual, but not impossible. A pilot pulling a late-night session, perhaps. But it was the program being run that made him sit up straight. The Hades Gauntlet. His brow furrowed. No one ran the gauntlet anymore. It was considered a waste of time, a demoralizing exercise in futility. He watched, intrigued, as the data streamed in. The anonymous user, logged in only as guest_01, was handling the simulation with a level of skill that was simply impossible. The flight path was a fluid, incomprehensible dance of chaos and precision. The pilot was breaking every rule in the book, executing maneuvers that defied the known limits of the F-35 Raptor, even in a simulation. They were using the canyon walls as shields, using the enemy's own missile locks to trick them into firing on each other. It was unorthodox, reckless, and utterly, breathtakingly brilliant. Thorne leaned closer to the screen, his heart starting to pound. The timer on the simulation ticked past the 4-minute mark, then 5, then 10. The pilot wasn't just surviving, they were dominating. They were a ghost in the machine, a phantom tearing through the digital hellscape with terrifying grace. He watched, mesmerized, as the final enemy fighter was dispatched with a maneuver so audacious he had to replay it 3 times to believe it. A reverse slipstream stall, culminating in a point-blank cannon burst. It was a move that shouldn't exist. The simulation ended. The final score flashed on the screen, a string of numbers that shattered every record ever set. Time, 17 minutes, 28 seconds. Kills, 24. Survival, 100%. Thorne stared, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a new record. It was a paradigm shift. Who was this pilot? This ghost who flew with the soul of a warrior poet? He immediately tried to trace the user ID, but it led nowhere, a dead end in the system. The log showed the session had been manually erased seconds after it concluded. Someone was covering their tracks. A thrill, the likes of which he hadn't felt in years, shot through him. This was it. This was the spark. He didn't know who this pilot was, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had to find them. The next morning, the main briefing theater buzzed with the cocksure energy of the base's elite squadron. The Reapers. At the center of it all was Captain Rex Vance, call sign Razor, with a chiseled jaw, an arrogant smirk permanently affixed to his face, and the best flight record on the base. Razor was the alpha pilot. He moved with an unshakable confidence that bordered on contempt for everyone else. He believed the world was divided into two groups: pilots like him, and the people who wished they were. General Thorne stood at the podium, his expression unreadable. On the main screen behind him was the data from the previous night's Hades Gauntlet simulation. He let the silent numbers hang in the air for a long moment before he spoke. Last night, he began, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. Someone on this base didn't just break the record for the Hades Gauntlet. They obliterated it. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Vance leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a look of bored amusement on his face. He whispered something to his wingman, who snickered in response. The pilot who flew this, Thorne continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled aces, demonstrated a level of instinctual, creative, and, frankly, dangerous flying I haven't seen in my entire career. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I want to know who it was. Vance let out a short, derisive laugh. General, with all due respect, that's got to be a glitch, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Look at those maneuvers. That's not flying, that's a video game. The physics are impossible. The system probably bugged out. Several other pilots nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting Vance's skepticism. It was easier to believe in a machine's error than in a pilot better than themselves. It was not a glitch, Captain, Thorne said, his tone sharpening. I reviewed the raw telemetry myself. Every input was manual. Every decision was human. Vance stood up, his arrogance radiating through the room. Then who was it? None of my guys would waste their time on that suicide run. We fly real missions, not fantasies. He gestured to the screen. This ghost pilot of yours flies with no discipline. No respect for protocol. They're a renegade. In a real combat situation, a pilot like that is a liability. They'd get themselves and their wingman killed. The general's eyes narrowed. Vance's dismissive attitude was the very thing he was fighting against, the rigid adherence to the rulebook that stifled true genius. This ghost hadn't shown a lack of discipline, they'd shown a mastery so profound they could afford to break the rules. They understood the art behind the science. A liability, Captain. Thorne's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. Or a legend in the making? Perhaps you're right. Perhaps a pilot like this is too unpredictable. Or perhaps, he fixed his gaze directly on Vance, they're simply better than you. The air in the room crackled with tension. Vance's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his pride wounded. The challenge had been laid. He saw the ghost pilot not as an inspiration, but as a threat to his throne. And he would do anything to prove they were a fraud. General Thorne was a strategist, not just in the air, but on the ground. He knew a direct hunt for his ghost pilot would be fruitless. They were clearly skilled at remaining invisible. So, he decided to set a trap, not with force, but with temptation. He knew that for a pilot of this caliber, the pull of the sky, even a digital one, was an addiction. The standard simulators were good, but there was one machine on the base that was a class above all others, the Chimera. It was the next generation of flight simulation, a state-of-the-art prototype so advanced and so sensitive that it was reserved only for the most classified development programs. Its feedback systems were flawless, its physics engine indistinguishable from reality. To fly the Chimera was to truly touch the void. Thorne gave a single, quiet order. The Chimera was to be prepped, loaded with the Hades Gauntlet scenario, and left unlocked and unattended during the night shift. He then had a small, high-resolution camera discreetly installed, feeding directly to the private terminal in his office. He was casting a line into the dark, hoping the phantom would bite. That night, Ilara began her rounds as usual, the squeak of her cart's wheels the only sound in the deserted corridors. But a strange energy hummed in the air, a tension that called in her stomach. As she neared the advanced simulation wing, she saw it. The door to the Chimera's chamber, usually sealed with a keypad and guarded, was slightly ajar. A sliver of soft blue light spilled out into the hallway. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This had to be a mistake. A breach of protocol. She should report it. She should turn around, walk away, and forget she ever saw it. That was the safe thing to do. The invisible thing to do. But her feet, acting on their own accord, carried her towards the light. She peered inside. The Chimera sat in the center of the room like a slumbering dragon, its cockpit glowing with an irresistible allure. On the main screen, she could see the words, Hades Gauntlet. Awaiting pilot, it was a siren's call. She was being tested. Or perhaps, she was being summoned. The conflict inside her was a hurricane. To enter that cockpit again was to risk everything, her anonymity, her quiet, painful peace. It was to invite the past to crash back into her present. But to walk away felt like a betrayal of the very essence of who she was, of the blood that flowed in her veins. In his office miles away, General Thorne watched his screen, his silhouette the only thing visible in the darkened room. He saw the janitor's cart stop. He saw the hooded figure hesitate at the door. He held his breath. For a long, agonizing moment, the figure remained perfectly still, a shadow caught between two worlds. Then, with a resolve that was visible even on the grainy camera feed, she stepped out of the hallway and into the light. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes locked on the screen. The ghost was about to fly again. The moment Ilara settled into the Chimera's cockpit, the world outside fell away. The familiar scent of ionized air and worn leather filled her senses, and a profound sense of rightness settled over her. This was where she belonged. As the canopy sealed her in, the simulation roared to life with a fidelity that was staggering. It wasn't like a screen anymore, it was a window. She could feel the subtle vibrations of the airframe, the faint whine of the turbines, the gentle push of inertia as she banked. In his office, General Thorne watched, utterly captivated. The data streaming from the Chimera was even more impressive than before. The ghost pilot was faster, sharper, more audacious. She moved with a liquid grace that was part predator, part artist. She wasn't just executing maneuvers, she was composing them, improvising a symphony of flight in the face of impossible odds. He saw her anticipate an enemy ambush from behind a ridge, not because of radar, but because she noticed the faint rotor wash kicking up dust on the canyon floor. He saw her use the sun's glare to blind an opponent, a classic tactic so old it had been forgotten by the new generation. She was using the environment, her machine, and her own mind as one seamless weapon. It was instinct. It was genius. When the simulation ended, Ilara didn't feel the same triumphant rush as before. She felt a deep, soul-shaking catharsis. It was as if a pressure valve that had been sealed for 10 years had finally been released. She leaned back, her body trembling with adrenaline and emotion, tears tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. The canopy hissed open, and the harsh fluorescent light of the chamber flooded the cockpit. And standing there, at the base of the steps, was General Thorne. His face was not angry or accusatory. It was filled with a look of profound, unadulterated awe. Ilara froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The ghost had been seen. There was nowhere left to hide. "The log identifies you as a guest," Thorne said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the shock he felt. "But I have a feeling that's not your name." Ilara couldn't speak. Her throat was tight with a decade of unspoken words. She could only stare at the man who had cornered her, the architect of her unmasking. He took a slow step forward. "I've been in this business for 35 years, he said, his eyes scanning her face, finally seeing past the janitor's uniform to the fire within. "I've seen the best pilots this world has to offer. But I have never, ever seen anyone fly like that. Who are you? Ilara finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper, rough with disuse. My name is Ilara. She wiped her hands on her grey jumpsuit, a nervous, habitual gesture. I'm a custodian. Thorn's gaze was unwavering. No, he said gently. That's what you do. That's not who you are. I want to know who you are. The general's quiet insistence broke through the dam of her carefully constructed walls. In the sterile silence of the simulation room, under the patient gaze of this powerful man, Ilara's story came pouring out. It began not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet, aching love. She spoke of her father, Colonel Marcus Vance, a man who didn't just fly jets but communed with them. His call sign was known to every pilot of his generation, a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear, Venom Viper. He was a legend, a maverick who pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible in the air. He taught her everything, not in a classroom, but in stories, in late-night talks over blueprints spread across the kitchen table, in the way his eyes would light up when he described the feeling of breaking through the clouds. She had been his prodigy, a natural in the cockpit from the moment she was old enough to reach the pedals. She was accepted into the Air Force Academy with top honors, her path seemingly set in stone. She was destined to follow his contrails into the sun. Then came the accident. It was a test flight for a new experimental fighter, the X-7 project. Something went wrong. A catastrophic failure at Mach 3. The official report was swift and clinical. It cited a pilot error, blaming her father's propensity for reckless maneuvers as the cause. It was a neat, tidy conclusion that protected the multi-billion-dollar contract with the aircraft's manufacturer. But Ilara knew her father. He was daring, but never reckless with his life. She fought the findings, pleaded with the board, presented her own analysis of the flight data that pointed to a fatal flaw in the wing assembly. She was dismissed as a grieving, emotional daughter. The institution she had loved, the one her father had given his life for, chose to bury a hero to protect a contract. Heartbroken and disillusioned, she walked away from it all. She couldn't bear the thought of flying in a sky that had been so cruelly taken from her, of serving a system that had so callously betrayed her father's memory. She vanished, taking on a new name, her mother's maiden name, and sought refuge in the one place no one would ever think to look for a pilot of her potential, the night shift. She chose to be a ghost, close enough to hear the roar of the engines, but forever grounded. As she finished her story, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. General Thorn had listened without interruption, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock, and finally, to a slow-burning anger. He remembered Colonel Vance. He remembered the whispers after the crash, the quiet doubts among the senior officers about the official story. Now, seeing the proof of that legendary skill living on in the eyes of this forgotten daughter, he knew. He knew she was telling the truth. They didn't just bury your father, Thorn said, his voice low and hard. They buried a legacy. They buried the truth. He looked at Ilara, no longer seeing a custodian, but the heir to a throne, a pilot whose raw talent had been forged in love and tempered by grief. It's time for that to change. The main briefing theater was packed, the air thick with anticipation and confusion. General Thorn had called an unscheduled, mandatory assembly of the base's entire command structure and all its active pilots. No one knew why. Captain Razor Vance sat in the front row, exuding his usual brand of smug impatience. He assumed this was another of the old man's boring lectures on protocol. General Thorn walked to the podium, his presence commanding immediate silence. For the past few days, he began, his voice echoing in the vast room, we have been searching for a ghost. A pilot whose skill is, without exaggeration, generational. A pilot who some of you, he glanced pointedly at Vance, dismissed as a system glitch. He let that sink in. Well, I found our ghost. He gestured towards the main entrance at the back of the theater. And I'd like you to meet them. The heavy doors swung open, and all heads turned. A figure stepped through, silhouetted for a moment against the bright hallway light before walking down the central aisle. It was Ilara. She wore her simple, grey custodian's jumpsuit, her face pale but her expression resolute. A wave of bewildered murmurs washed over the room. Pilots looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Was this a joke? They recognized her, vaguely. The quiet woman who cleaned their offices, who emptied their trash cans. Razor Vance watched her approach with a sneer of contempt. He leaned over to his wingman. "You've got to be kidding me." The old man's lost his mind. Elara stopped at the foot of the stage, standing beside the general, her small frame looking even more diminutive next to his imposing figure. She kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to shrink under the hundreds of skeptical stares. "This," General Thorne announced, his voice booming with authority, "is the pilot who shattered every record on the Hades Gauntlet." The murmuring erupted into outright scoffing and pockets of disbelieving laughter. The absurdity of the situation was too much for them. This woman? This janitor? It was impossible. Vance, unable to contain his scorn, let out a loud, theatrical laugh that cut through the noise. The room fell quiet, all eyes on him as he slowly got to his feet. He looked not at the general, but directly at Elara, his eyes dripping with derision. "A janitor," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He took a few steps forward, circling her like a predator. "Well, I've got to hand it to you, General. That's a good one." "So, you're the ghost?" he asked Elara directly, his tone mocking and cruel. "Tell me, what's your call sign? Mop Bucket? Or maybe the Dust Bunny?" Snickers and jeers rippled through the squadron. Elara's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her own eyes like chips of ice. The room was electric with tension. General Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury, but he remained silent, letting the scene play out. He knew what was coming. He had orchestrated this moment with deliberate precision. Vance leaned in closer, his smirk widening. He was enjoying this, enjoying the public humiliation of this nobody who had somehow become the general's pet project. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't be shy," he taunted, his voice a venomous whisper that carried through the silent theater. "The general says you're a pilot. Every pilot has a call sign. Impress us." "What is it?" Elara took a slow breath, drawing strength from a place deep inside her, a place where her father's memory lived. She straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice was not the timid whisper of a janitor, but the clear, steady command of a pilot. It was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Venom Viper. The name dropped into the room like a 10-ton bomb. And for a full 10 seconds, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the stunned, absolute silence of 100 men trying to process two words that had just upended their entire world. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The snickering died in the pilots' throats. The smirks on their faces vanished, replaced by masks of slack-jawed shock. Vance's arrogant posture collapsed as if his strings had been cut. His face went white, the color draining from it so fast he looked like he might be sick. The name Venom Viper was not just a call sign, it was a sacred text in the holy book of aviation. It belonged to Colonel Marcus Vance, a pilot who had become a myth, a legend whose ghost was said to still haunt the hangars. He was the yardstick against which all of them, including Razor, had measured themselves and been found wanting. An older colonel in the front row let out an audible gasp, his hand flying to his mouth. He had flown with the original Venom Viper. He stared at Elara, at the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and for the first time, he saw the resemblance. He saw the legend reborn. The mockery, the skepticism, the arrogance, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by a wave of disbelief, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a profound and chilling sense of awe. They weren't looking at a janitor anymore. They were looking at royalty. They were in the presence of a legacy they thought had been lost to history. Razor Vance stumbled back a step, the name echoing in his ears. Venom Viper. He finally understood the impossible skill, the unorthodox genius. It wasn't a glitch. It was a bloodline. The woman standing before him in a janitor's uniform carried the spirit of the greatest pilot he had ever known. And he had just laughed in her face. The silence was finally broken by General Thorne. "Captain Vance," he said, his voice like cracking ice. You wanted to see a real pilot? You've got one. Now sit down. The aftermath of the revelation was a storm of activity. Ilara was no longer a ghost, she was a phenomenon. The story of Colonel Vance's daughter, the hidden prodigy, spread through the base like wildfire. The skepticism was replaced by a fervent, almost mythic belief in her abilities. But Thorne knew that talk was cheap. A legend had to be proven. He officially reinstated Ilara's commission on a special probationary status, her past qualifications and her undeniable skill making the process swift. Then, he announced the ultimate test, a live combat trial. A one-on-one aerial exercise. Ilara, in a standard F-035, versus Captain Razor Vance, in his own personally calibrated jet. The entire base held its breath. The day of the trial, the sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Ilara, now dressed in a flight suit that fit her as if it were a second skin, walked towards her jet with a calm focus that unnerved the ground crew. She was no longer hiding. Vance, on the other hand, was a mess of coiled tension. His arrogance had been shattered, replaced by a desperate need to prove that he still belonged at the top. This was no longer about ego, it was about survival. The two jets took to the sky, silver needles against the vast canvas of the heavens. The exercise began. Vance flew with brutal, textbook perfection. He was aggressive, precise, pushing his aircraft to its absolute limits. He was a machine of war. But Ilara was something else entirely. She was an artist. She didn't fight the air, she danced with it. She anticipated Vance's moves before he made them, countering his calculated aggression with fluid, intuitive grace. She wasn't just flying the plane, she had become the plane. The climax of the trial came when Vance, frustrated and overeager, pushed his jet into a high G-turn that was too tight. A compressor stall. His engine choked, sending his plane into a terrifying, unrecoverable flat spin. Alarms blared in his cockpit. He was a passenger in a falling coffin. But then, a shadow fell over him. It was Ilara. Instead of claiming her victory, she had positioned her jet directly above his, deliberately flying into his turbulent wake. Using an incredibly dangerous and precise maneuver her father had taught her, she used the airflow from her own wings to disrupt the spin of his aircraft, stabilizing it just enough for him to regain control mere thousands of feet from the ground. She hadn't just beaten him. She had saved him. On the ground, Vance stumbled from his cockpit, his face pale and slick with sweat. He watched as Ilara's jet landed with impossible softness. He was humbled, not by her skill, but by her character. She had held his life in her hands and had chosen grace over glory. He walked over to her as she deplaned, the entire base watching. He stopped before her and, in an act that stunned everyone, he drew himself to attention and rendered a sharp, perfect salute. He said, his voice thick with emotion. Request permission to be your first student. Ilara looked at him, and for the first time in 10 years, her smile reached her eyes. She returned the salute. A new era had begun. Ilara Vance, now proudly carrying her father's name and call sign, didn't just become another pilot in the squadron. She became its soul. Her perspective, born from loss and forged in the shadows, revolutionized their training. She taught them that flying wasn't just about mastering a machine, it was about mastering oneself. She taught instinct over procedure, creativity over protocol. She taught them to listen to the wind, to feel the sky. Razor became her most devoted student, his arrogance replaced by a quiet, fierce loyalty. He learned that true strength wasn't about being the best, but about making everyone around you better. General Thorne watched it all, his faith rewarded. He had looked past a uniform and seen a hero. He had wagered his career on a ghost, and in doing so, he had saved the future of his Air Force. Ilara, standing on the flight line as the sun set, watched her pilots, her squadron, her family, land one by one. She had finally made peace with the sky. It had taken her father, but it had also given her a purpose, to ensure his legacy would live on not as a tragic memory, but as a living, breathing inspiration for generations to come. So, the next time you walk past someone, take a second look, Look deeper than the clothes they wear or the job they do. Try to see the universe behind their eyes. Because you never know. The quiet person mopping the floor might just be a hero waiting for their wings. The silent figure in the corner might be a legend waiting to be reborn. True greatness is all around us, hidden in the most unlikely of places. All we have to do is be willing to see it. Share this story if you believe that everyone has a hidden talent. Remind someone today that you see their true worth. Because one small act of recognition can be all it takes to help a ghost remember how to fly.